Hey, Life Group leaders, this is Pastor Adam. I hope you're doing well today. This week, we're going to be in Genesis 3. So I hope you've enjoyed our new study on the book of Genesis. So we've had a week where we talked about God being eternal, God creating everything, God's first couple. And now we start getting into what happened with God's creation, what happened specifically with the first couple, Adam and Eve. So before we get into the three main things I want to talk about, which are temptation, the fall, sin, and then God's rescue, mercy, and grace, a little context. This is familiar to you. Don't necessarily assume, though, that it's familiar to the people in your room. The more that we share the gospel, especially with younger people, the more I learn that we can't just always jump in with the Romans road. Sometimes we have to go back to the very beginning. So don't assume people in your room have a strong context when you start talking about Adam and Eve and sin. So who's in this passage? Who's in the story? Obviously Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve lived perfectly in paradise in a perfect peace with God. They walked with God. They talked with God in the garden. Everything was perfect. Creation functioned perfectly. God gave humans dominion over creation. They were in charge. They were made in His image and for His glory. And God had forbidden Adam and Eve from partaking from one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and of evil. And as we know, unfortunately, they did not obey God's command. Sin entered the world, and the world would never be the same. So the first thing I want to talk about is temptation. And I'm going to do these three topics talking about then and now. So you've watched HGTV. They showed the before pictures and then the current pictures. That's kind of what we're going to do. We're going to talk about temptation then and what that means for us now as we go along. So the first temptation, the first targets for temptation were Adam and Eve. The enemy had put his target on them, and he wanted to take them out. Now, one thing that is kind of unique to Adam and Eve is the idea of free will. So Adam and Eve had no sin nature. There was no sin in the world. There was no sin in their hearts. They had total and full ability to choose one thing or another thing. They had total free will. No generational sin, no context of sin. And Eve was targeted, and she chose to believe the serpent. She chose to be deceived. And then she led her husband into deception as well. So we have Adam and Eve, we have God, and then we have the tempter, Satan. Now, what did he do? He caused them to question God's word, to question God's intent. Did God really say, does God really want you to do this thing? Is that really what He's wanting? Okay, so that's what happened then. So what happens with temptation now? Well, as much credit as we give Satan, we need to remember that he uses the same old tricks to accomplish his purposes. So Satan's tricks have not changed. He still attempts and causes people to doubt God's word. Look around in the world. Look within mistakes you've made in your past. Look within your family and your friends. And what you'll often see is that it all begins with a mistrust, a misbelief, a temptation to not believe God's word. Now, here's another thing with sin now, is that it begins in the hidden places, that the seeds of sin begins inside of us before any outward act happens. The journey to outward sin begins without any outward act happening. It starts from within. Now, somebody told me this years ago. It's always stuck with me. We can think of sin a lot of times as the devil showing up at our door with a pitchfork saying, I am here to tempt you with sin. We'll picture a devil on one shoulder and an angel on another. But the reality is that as we walk through life, it's not always that easy to recognize the schemes of the devil. And what this person told me is that sin does not appear at your doorstep as a devil and a pitchfork. He appears as something that you've always wanted, something that you've always wanted to experience. And that is how he deceives you. A few things that I wrote down, I was thinking through this. Here's some things that the enemy knows. The enemy knows what your weakness is. He knows when you are weak, and he knows how to attack. So, given this knowledge, he proceeds to take you out. Every day when you wake up, you get out of bed and your feet hit the floor. The enemy's task, his goal, is to take you out and to take your family out. We talked about that this past semester in Better Man as we as men were learning to be better husbands, better fathers, better employees, better leaders. The enemy's job is to take us out. And we should never, ever forget that. If we can keep that concept in our mind, that we are fighting a true enemy, that will help us as we go about every day. So we have temptation then, and obviously we're still being tempted now. So what happened after temptation? The fall of man, sin. Sin entered the world, and literally everything changed. Nature changed, people changed, the relationship between God and people changed. The Bible said that the ground would become hard to work, child labor was going to be painful, and then most importantly, the relationship with God was fractured beyond repair, as it seemed, except that God obviously had a plan. But the relationship with other humans was also broken. The relationship between Adam and Eve would never be the same. The relationship with them and their children and the generation after generation would never be the same. So that's what sin looked like then as it entered the world. So what does it look like now? I think we have to be aware that sin affects and infects every aspect of our life. It has affected everything that we experience every day, internally and externally. Now, one thing that's important to understand, because the culture would not have you view sin this way, is that you need to be aware that every person, including myself and you, we are sinners by nature and we are sinners by choice. Okay, so first of all, we inherit sin. We inherit a sin nature. One of the things I used to tell kids when I was a kids pastor is, imagine that you started buttoning up your shirt in the morning, and you started with the button going through the wrong spot. But you went about your business buttoning up your shirt down the rest of the way, but it's wrong. Why is it wrong? Because you started in the wrong spot. And so on down the chain, on down through the buttons, everything else was off because the first one was off. We inherit sin from our parents. Just like you might have your eye color of your mom and dad, their nose, their ears, their height, their hair, different things like that. We inherit a sinful nature from our parents. And ever since the days of Adam and Eve, that has been passed down from generation to generation. But we're not only sinners by nature, we're sinners by choice. See, we talked about Adam and Eve having free will. The fact of the matter is that humans today, we don't have true free will. We talked about being sinners by nature. You don't have to teach kids how to sin. They just do it. They're naturally selfish. They naturally don't behave. They naturally sin. Now, we are responsible for our choices, and God does not make us sin, but our wills are far from free. As we inherit this sinful nature, we have a bent to sin, and that's why we need God's help, because we can't help ourselves. We are naturally sinful people. We have all went astray. There is no one good, no, not one. What does the Bible say? All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and that's why we need His help. You and I are sinful people that deserve punishment, and we are responsible for our choices. You may have heard this saying as well, but this has always stuck with me as someone divine sin. It's been said that sin will take you farther than you want to go, cost you more than you want to spend, and keep you longer than you want to stay. And that's what the enemy does. He tempts us with a sin that seems pleasurable, and then we give in to that sin, and he does a 180 and starts to beat us over the head with the sin and say, how could you do that? How could you be so stupid as to do that? But that's exactly what he wants to do. That's why we should have a serious view of sin. Sin should not be taken lightly. I just read this week from Spurgeon. He said that we should never find pleasure in the things that Jesus died for. We should never find pleasure in the things that Jesus sacrificed his life for. Another aspect of sin that the enemy would want to confuse us about is the ripple effect. You may have experienced this in your family as well, but when there is an adulterous relationship, abuse in the home, these are sensitive and serious topics. But when people first get into these sins, they don't realize that the ripple effect that they're going to have. sin has a ripple effect, and it touches so many people's lives that we can't even conceive of how far the scope goes beyond what we realize. Is that we think the decisions that we're making kind of happen in a bubble, and if something goes wrong, it's just going to affect us. That is so far from the truth. This sin started in the world with two people, with Adam and Eve, and the rest of humanity has been affected. A major, obviously, ripple effect. So don't be deceived. Don't believe the lies of the enemy. So that's a lot of bad news that I just put on us, right? Okay, so here's the good news, is that God has a plan. God has mercy for you and I, and he has grace for you and I. But what did that look like then? Well, after Adam and Eve fell, God showed them grace. He gave them what they didn't deserve. He gave them animal skins for coverings. Obviously, an animal was killed for that, for the needs of humanity, which would start pointing towards the sacrifices and an ultimate future sacrifice. He gave them mercy too. So you've often seen, grace is getting what I don't deserve, and mercy is not getting what I do deserve. And God did that for them. God could have killed Adam and Eve on the spot. He would have been fully just to do that. But he did not do that. He gave them animal skins to be covered. He had told them that they had to leave the garden. Now, I was reading this week that, a lot of people view that as just a punishment, that they fell and God was punishing them and they had to leave. But if you read the text in Genesis 3, it also says that they need to leave lest they eat from the tree of life and live forever. So in a lot of ways, God did not want them to experience a life of fallenness and a life that lived forever in that state. So by his mercy, he had them leave the garden. Now, for you and I, we have a huge measure of grace given to us, is that in that God has given everything for us. God sent his son Jesus to die for us. He died so that we could be forgiven, and we obviously don't deserve that. As sinners by nature and sinners by choice, we deserve the wrath of God. And then God could justly and immediately give us what we do deserve, eternal punishment for sin, being separated from God in never-ending torment. So what does that mean for us? We talked about what it means for Adam and Eve. We talked some aspects for us. So let's look at this through kind of two windows. What does that mean for believers, and what does that mean for non-believers? For believers, what do? Believers, we should know God's word. So we spot the counterfeit bill by knowing the real thing. The banks teach people that work at the bank how to spot a counterfeit bill by knowing what a real bill looks like. And so we need to know God's word so that when the enemy tempts us to question God's word, we can recognize that, we can call that out. So not only should we know God's word, we should also know God's people. We should be in community. We should not be isolated. We need God's people around us to hold one another accountable. Isolation is a very dangerous place for the Christian to be. So just as the animal that leaves the pack becomes vulnerable, he is alone, he is easy prey for the lion. If you've seen that on the National Geographic channels, there's always one that leaves the pack, and the hunter is just waiting to pounce on them, and that's what we do as well. For non-believers, assume that you have a non-believer in your class and imagine what they're thinking about. They need to understand that they do not need to be deceived by the tactics of the enemy, but they first need to believe in Jesus. They need to surrender to him as Lord for eternal forgiveness, and then they need to know his word for daily direction, to connect with community, connect with the local church to avoid isolation. So as you study for this lesson, as you pray over what exactly you would have God to say to your group, pray over this, study, talk to them about what sin is, what it looks like, to not be deceived. The enemy is not up to anything new. He first encourages us to question God's word, and then we fall into temptation, then we ultimately fall into sin. So encourage your people to be in the word, encourage them to continue to be in community and to be aware of the enemy's tactics. And as we come together as a church family, we can help one another avoid the sin that God certainly does not want in our life. Well, hey, thanks for watching our video this week. I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me, and I would love to help you along the way. Thanks, and have a great day.